In the pale, trembling light of dawn, when the mist still clung to the low valleys, and the wooden eaves of ancestral estates dripped with the night's cold breath, the figure of a mounted warrior emerged as the living symbol of an era in which strength, dignity, and absolute inner discipline were woven into the very rhythm of life. A high-ranking bushi of early Japan was not simply a soldier armed for battle, but a horse knight whose presence on the field carried with it the authority of his clan, the voice of his ancestors, and the silent expectation of exemplary conduct. The image of such a rider, wrapped in lacquered armor that caught the dim light like smoldering embers, stood at the core of Japanese military culture, representing harmony between man and movement, steel and silence, power and restraint. It was no coincidence that long before the more elaborate schools of swordsmanship and archery emerged, the art of horsemanship shaped the foundation of the warrior tradition that later generations would call Bushido. For the earliest clans understood that command began not with the blade, but with the ability to master oneself through the mastery of the horse. The plains and foothills, still unsettled and raw, echoed with the steady rhythm of hoofbeats long before written chronicles attempted to capture the pulse of the age. Archaeological finds across ancient Yamato lands reveal fragments of bridles, stirrups, and small bronze fittings that once rested on the bodies of horses brought from the continent along the shifting routes of migration and trade. As clans grew in influence and sought to protect their territories from rivals, the mounted warrior came to be revered as the embodiment of sovereign will, capable of crossing great distances, carrying messages, leading troops, and striking with a mobility unknown to the early foot soldiers. The horse knight became a figure around which stories of loyalty and betrayal, wisdom and ferocity slowly crystallized, echoing through campfires and whispered across stables long after the dust of battle had settled. It was in these early images that the Japanese spirit of unity between man and beast was first articulated, a quiet understanding that the horse was not merely a mount, but an extension of the warrior's intent. Over the centuries, as the Yamato state strengthened and the territories of influential families expanded outward, the silhouette of the horseman came to signify not only military might, but also cultivated presence. The rider who guided his steed across rugged hills and narrow forest paths moved with a grace that seemed almost meditative, as if each shift of weight and every measured breath was part of an older, deeper rhythm. In the minds of those who observed him, he personified a harmony of body and spirit that would later define the samurai class. And yet, behind this serene vision lay a world of constant tension, political rivalry simmering beneath alliances, regions unsettled by rebellions, borders drawn and redrawn in the struggle for dominance. The horseman rode between these realities, balancing honor with survival, tradition with the demands of war. As the day's first sunlight broke through the haze and settled on the armored figure at the crest of a ridge, there was a sense that his stillness concealed a force waiting to be unleashed, as though the land itself leaned in to witness the moment. And just as his horse stamped the earth, sending a shiver through the quiet air, the story of how equestrian art shaped the destiny of Bushi culture began to unfold. Yet the true origins of this ancient partnership, hidden in distant migrations and forgotten exchanges across seas and empires, would reveal an even deeper layer of meaning that awaited in the next chapter. Long before the chronicles of the Heian courtiers captured the elegance of mounted archers and the swift movements of clan riders, the horse arrived in the archipelago as a quiet outsider, its presence at first rare and almost mythical. The earliest traces of equestrian culture in Japan point to the late Kofun period, when iron stirrups, ornate bridles, and the remains of compact but resilient steppe horses began to appear in burial mounds of influential chieftains. These objects, carried over the waters from the Korean peninsula and influenced by Chinese command traditions, marked a turning point in the evolution of local warfare. The horse did not simply step into an established world, it reshaped it. The arrival of mounted combat transformed regional disputes between clans into fast-moving campaigns, where power could shift in a single night if a rider found a way through mountain passes before the enemy even learned of his departure. The early clans of Yamato quickly understood that the horse offered more than speed.
It provided reach, allowing alliances to form across greater distances and enabling leaders to display strength through grand processions of mounted retainers. Stables rose beside ancestral residences, their wooden beams smelling of straw and smoke, their floors echoing with the restless tapping of hooves. In those dim, earthy spaces, young warriors first learned to approach the animals with a calm mind, guided by elders who spoke of the horse not as a possession, but as a companion shaped by divine breath. The bond between warrior and animal emerged slowly, built through daily routines of feeding, grooming, and breathing in unison during the earliest training sessions at dawn. Influences from the continent continued to shape this evolving bond. From China came advanced saddle designs and the idea of the mounted officer as an agent of state authority. From Korea arrived stirrup innovations that allowed a rider to remain steady even during sudden charges. From Mongolian steppes lingered the concept of lightning attacks executed by small, disciplined units that moved as one with their horses. Yet Japan, closed in by mountains and separated by seas, absorbed these influences in its own way, transforming foreign techniques into a distinctly local philosophy centered on harmony with the animal spirit rather than on pure domination. In the quiet pre-dawn hours when fog hung over training grounds like a pale curtain, one could witness the earliest expressions of what would later become the samurai approach to horsemanship. Warriors practiced controlled breathing, guiding their horses with subtle shifts of the hips rather than the reins, learning to feel the tremors of tension before a sudden move, listening for that almost imperceptible moment when the animal's will aligned with their own. Around these practices grew a belief that the horse was not merely a vehicle, but a mirror of the rider's inner state, responding to calmness with steadiness, to fear with agitation, and to resolve with unbroken rhythm. In this understanding lay the foundation of the bushi worldview. Mastery began within, and the horse was both teacher and partner. As centuries passed, the presence of horses expanded across the islands. Fields were cleared to make room for larger grazing lands, and specialized craftsmen emerged to create fittings that blended durability with aesthetic refinement. Each clan established its own practices, shaping horses according to terrain, tradition, and the temperament of its warriors. And yet, despite their differences, all shared a common thread: the belief that no warrior could rise in rank without understanding the language of movement spoken through the animal beneath him. But as the importance of horses grew, so too did the complexity of their role in politics and warfare. Rival clans sought to acquire the strongest lines of breeding stock, and conflicts over grazing territories escalated into broader disputes. In the shadows of these tensions, the horse became not only a partner, but a catalyst for power, drawing Japan into an age where equestrian warfare defined the hierarchy of the rising samurai class. And it was in this shifting landscape, just as the influence of mounted combat reached its peak, that the evolution of rider and warhorse equipment began. Equipment that would soon transform the silhouette of the Japanese mounted warrior in ways unseen before.
In the dim corridors of clan armories, where lacquered chests exhaled the scent of old cedar and iron, the equipment of the mounted samurai took shape as a delicate balance between protection, mobility, and the quietly refined sense of beauty that marked every aspect of Japanese craftsmanship. A warrior preparing for battle did not merely don armor, he stepped into a centuries-old dialogue between form and function, weight and movement, silence and intention. The umayuroi, the armor designed specifically for riders, embraced the body with plates connected by silk cords dyed in subdued tones, each knot tied with the careful precision of a craftsman who understood that even the smallest detail could determine life or death. These plates shielded the torso while distributing weight so that the rider could lean forward during a charge without feeling encumbered, allowing the armor to move in harmony with both man and horse. Along the warrior's legs hung haidate and sunyate, protective guards that followed the curves of the thighs and shins, their metal scales arranged in overlapping patterns reminiscent of river stones.
These pieces were designed not to hinder, but to guide movement, enabling the rider to grip the saddle with the knees and shift balance in a fluid rhythm that kept him steady even as the horse plunged through uneven fields or dodged incoming arrows. Over his back, a cloak-like horo billowed in the wind, its light fabric transforming into a protective cushion that could deflect or slow projectiles. When the horse accelerated, the horo expanded, creating a silhouette that symbolized both status and skill, fluttering like a banner of living breath behind the rider. Just as carefully crafted was the equipment of the war horse, whose role demanded not only endurance, but resilience. Saddle makers shaped Chinese-inspired saddles with slightly elevated front and rear arches, offering stability during sudden turns or mounted archery. The stirrups, often carved in thick metal, curved around the feet like small platforms that allowed the rider to stand and shoot at full gallop. Leather breastplates, cheek guards, and flank coverings shielded the animal from stray blades and collapsing formations, each fitted with cords and loops that allowed quick removal or repair in tense moments. Even the bridles, with their silk cords and intricate knots, reflected a deep respect for the animal. They were made not to choke or force, but to communicate, encouraging trust rather than submission. In the midday sun, as a fully armed rider mounted his equally protected horse, the combined image struck observers with an almost ceremonial gravity. The armor did not glitter flamboyantly, for such display contradicted the restrained aesthetic of the warrior class. Instead, it absorbed the light in muted reflections, as though holding the memory of countless past battles within the folds of its lacquer and iron. Everything about the equipment, its weight, its balance, its quiet beauty, served a single purpose: to allow the rider to move as though he were unarmored, to strike with precision, and to remain centered no matter how chaotic the battlefield became. Behind the stillness of this image, however, lay the intense dependency on the techniques that allowed warrior and horse to function as one. The equipment alone could not create a perfect rider. It merely supported the profound physical communication forged through training. And as the shadows lengthened across the training grounds, the question arose of how these riders learned to control such powerful animals with movements so subtle they seemed almost invisible. A question that leads directly into the heart of their techniques and battlefield tactics, where true mastery revealed itself in the smallest shift of breath and the most silent decisions amid the storm of war. When the first tremor of hoofbeats touched the earth before dawn drills, a seasoned observer could read in that rhythm the essence of samurai horsemanship, an art that demanded not mere command, but a unity of intention so profound that the line between rider and horse dissolved into a single will. The mastery known as zoba-jutsu, the art of mounting combat on land, and its rare counterpart, suiba-jutsu, practiced across shallow rivers and marshes, were not simply techniques. They represented a physical philosophy in which the warrior learned to communicate through breath, balance, and weight. Hands remained light on the reins, for a skilled rider did not steer with force, but guided through subtle shifts of the hips and the tightening of knees, as though the horse could feel thoughts before they became actions. Treatises from the early Edo period, such as the writings of Hitomi Sensei in 1613, describe these interactions not as commands, but as conversations, each movement a word, each adjustment a sentence spoken in the shared language of momentum. During training, the rider learned to change speed with fluid precision, accelerating into a charge with a low, forward-leaning posture, then rising slightly to allow the horse to slow or pivot without losing balance. The battlefield demanded constant adaptation. Dodging arrows required sharp, spiraling movements. Closing distance for spear combat demanded explosive bursts of speed. The rider had to sense the tremble in the animal's muscles before a jump or evasive turn, responding with a calm weight shift that transformed panic into controlled grace. In the chaos of combat, the difference between survival and defeat lay in these micro-movements, unseen by most observers, yet essential to the warrior's art. The mounted archer, the earliest archetype of the samurai elite, embodied this mastery with every passing second. Drawing the bow required the rider to stand in the stirrups, allowing the hips to float independently of the horse's strides. This ability created a visual illusion, a moment in which the upper body moved with calm precision while the lower body absorbed the storm of galloping hooves. The release of the arrow echoed like a pulse through the battlefield, its trajectory shaped by the horse's rhythm as much as the archer's breath. A single rider maneuvering among infantry could confuse formations, striking swiftly before disappearing behind hills or trees, leaving only the fading thud of retreating hooves. Spearmen on horseback performed a different, but equally demanding form of artistry. A single thrust delivered at full speed required perfect timing. Too early and the weapon's reach fell short. Too late, and the rider risked losing balance or letting the momentum wrench the spear from his grasp. The long shaft vibrated against the wind, and the rider felt each tremor as an extension of his own pulse. In tightly coordinated units, riders executed sweeping flanking maneuvers, forcing enemy formations to compress or scatter. The horse's ears flicked back and forth, reading the battlefield as instinctively as the warrior who urged it forward. Yet the battlefield was never predictable. Muddy terrain could swallow hooves without warning. Narrow forest paths demanded extreme precision. Sudden volleys of arrows could turn open plains into deadly traps. The samurai learned to make decisions within breaths, trusting the horse to react faster than thought itself. When the smell of crushed grass mingled with dust and sweat, and the cries of soldiers rose in fractured waves, the rider's world narrowed to the beat of hooves beneath him. It was in that beat, steady or frantic, rising or faltering, that he sensed both danger and opportunity. In that crucible of movement and instinct, a transformation occurred. Horse and riders ceased to be separate entities. They became a single fighting organism, swift, aware, fluid, and deadly. And yet, the legacy of this unity did not remain confined to mounted combat alone. As the centuries progressed, the techniques refined in the saddle began to shape the evolution of other martial disciplines across Japan, weaving equestrian philosophy into schools of archery, spearwork, and even swordsmanship. How these influences spread into every corner of the warrior tradition forms the next chapter in the unfolding story.
As centuries unfolded and the mounted warrior became a familiar presence across the shifting mosaic of Japan's provinces, the principles refined in the saddle began to seep into the broader landscape of martial disciplines. It was not simply that mounted combat influenced ground fighting, rather the way a horseman understood rhythm, distance, timing, and calm under pressure suddenly reshaped the foundations of bujutsu as a whole. The rider who learned to shoot a bow at full gallop developed an instinct for reading movement in split seconds, an intuition that carried naturally into the schools of archery practiced on foot. The breathing patterns that stabilized a warrior while standing in the stirrups later informed the meditative calm taught by masters of Kyudo, where stillness was not the absence of motion but its controlled transformation. Mounted archery, yabusame, stood as one of the most visible legacies of equestrian influence, a ceremony that preserved not only technique but the spirit of concentration required to strike 3 targets while hurtling down a narrow track. The archer did not simply pull the bowstring. He embodied the composure that in ancient times decided the fate of clans on the battlefield. Observers saw the spectacle, but only those who had once trained beside restless horses understood the deeper meaning. The mind's steadiness shaped the body's precision. In this ritualized art, echoes of early mounted warfare lingered like faint hoofbeats across the centuries. Spearsmanship, too, absorbed the lessons of the rider. Before infantry tactics evolved to counter cavalry, mounted spearmen relied on enormous weapons whose reach allowed them to strike downward or across enemy formations. The techniques developed to stabilize such long spears on horseback did not vanish when combat moved increasingly to foot. They re-emerged in spear schools where practitioners learned to harness momentum, shifting their weight with the same flowing logic a rider used when leaning into or away from a charge. Even the subtle turns of the hips which allowed a mounted warrior to keep balance during a sudden stop translated into powerful rotational techniques on the ground, shaping the way spearmen generated force. Swordsmanship carried an even deeper imprint. Though the iconic image of the samurai is often tied to foot soldiers dueling in later centuries, the early longswords, tachi and later nodachi, were initially designed with mounted combat in mind. Their curvature and length responded to the sweeping arcs of a descending strike from horseback.
The practice of lifting the blade high, letting its weight merge with the downward movement of the rider, taught warriors to coordinate upper and lower body as a single mechanism. This integrated movement survived long after cavalry lost prominence, becoming a cornerstone of kenjutsu footwork. Masters who had never ridden a horse still echoed the old principles without realizing their origin. Balance from the hips, cuts delivered with the whole body, steps made as though propelled by an unseen momentum. Even infantry strategies reflected the perpetual presence of mounted warriors. The use of hooks and long polearms designed to pull riders from their saddles forced samurai to train balance techniques that kept them rooted despite sudden impacts. These defensive instincts influenced later grappling styles, where maintaining center of gravity under force became an essential lesson. The battlefield itself, once shaped by galloping charges, sudden flanking runs, and spiraling evasive maneuvers, left behind a tactical legacy that continued to structure training halls long after the dust of cavalry battles had faded. Across all these disciplines, one truth lingered. The rider's art was never solely about physical mastery. It demanded acute perception, the ability to sense shifts in environment, the subtle alignment of breath and intention. Those who trained in other arts began to realize that the calm focus cultivated in the saddle could transform any discipline, whether archery, swordsmanship, or hand-to-hand combat. Yet, just as equestrian influence reached its most refined expression, history ushered in shifts that would slowly erode the battlefield dominance of the mounted warrior. And as changing times closed one chapter, the question arose, what would become of the ancient art of the rider when war itself no longer required the thunder of hooves?
As the long arc of Japanese history bent toward stability, the echo of hooves that once thundered across plains and rose from forest paths began to fade beneath the weight of changing times. The landscape itself, with its steep ridges, narrow valleys, and dense woodlands, had always posed natural limits to the large-scale cavalry maneuvers seen on continental battlefields. Maintaining warhorses demanded not only wealth, but land, fodder, skilled caretakers, and a constant flow of resources that only the wealthiest clans could sustain. Even so, during eras of unrest, these challenges were overcome by necessity. But when the Tokugawa shogunate ushered in 2.5 centuries of peace, the purpose that once justified such immense expenses slowly dissolved. With warfare receding into the distance and rigid hierarchy replacing the fluid chaos of earlier clashes, the practical need for mounted combat diminished. The warhorse, once a vital force shaping the rise and fall of clans, began to shift from battlefield companion to symbol of status. Stables that had once housed restless animals prepared for swift campaigns were transformed into quiet ceremonial facilities where selected horses were groomed for processions rather than war. The techniques of zoba jutsu, refined over generations, found themselves increasingly confined to training grounds where young samurai practiced not for battle, but for demonstration, ritualized echoes of a time when life hung on the precision of every movement. Yet even as cavalry declined, the essence of its philosophy found new life in the cultural practices of the Edo period. Mounted archery, yabusame, evolved into a ceremonial art performed at shrines, its thundering gallop and arrow strikes no longer deciding the fate of armies, but invoking prayers for prosperity, good harvests, and spiritual balance. Courtly equestrian displays preserved the forms of ancient riding styles, their performances designed to honor tradition rather than to prepare for war. The art of controlling a horse through breath, posture, and intention became a meditation on discipline rather than a necessity of survival. The decline of mounted warfare also influenced the internal landscape of samurai identity. Warriors who had once learned to read battlefields from horseback now found themselves seeking deeper meaning in the philosophies that had guided their ancestors. The bond between horse and rider, forged through trust and mutual respect, transformed into an ideal of internal harmony, an understanding that mastery of any art began with the mastery of oneself.
The physical experience of merging with the rhythm of an animal gave way to the spiritual pursuit of merging with one's own movement, breath, and purpose, a legacy reflected in the calm poise of martial artists, the slow precision of traditional ceremonies, and the silent dignity of those who carried forward the bushi spirit into a world with fewer battles. Even in the peaceful streets of Edo, where merchants outnumbered warriors and horses served mostly for transport, the image of the mounted samurai lingered like a distant echo. Painters captured its silhouette against mountain skies. Poets wrote of hooves that once shook the earth, and storytellers preserved its memory in tales recited by firelight. And though time moved forward, erasing the immediacy of the cavalry charge, it could not erase the deeper imprint left by generations of riders who had shaped the soul of Japan. For in the quiet heart of every discipline born from the warrior tradition, whether the stillness of Kyudo, the measured steps of Kenjutsu, or the intimate precision of tea ceremonies, there remained a subtle thread connecting back to the horseman who once rode across shifting borders, carrying not only weapons but ideals. His legacy endured in the pursuit of harmony, in the disciplined alignment of body and mind, and in the belief that true mastery is achieved only when movement flows without force. And so, even as the last echoes of cavalry faded into history, the spirit of the rider refused to vanish. It lived on in practices that sought union with rhythm and intention, in the quiet determination of those who trained long after war had passed, and in the timeless idea that harmony between being and motion is the highest expression of strength. And somewhere, in the imagination of those who still listened for it, the distant, steady beat of hooves continued to resonate, guiding them toward the deeper story that began long before peace settled over the land.